On.
So picking up where I left off, a couple things to note. Uh, when Louis XVI and his wife were executed, the ultimate charge was that they were considered counter-revolutionary. They weren't bringing about the liberty, equality, and fraternity that the people had supposedly wanted. But again, like a lot of revolutions that start out with noble ideals, once it began, it quickly raveled out of control. And George Danton is a good example of this. So he was a great political orator, a professional lawyer. He was one of the people who advocated for the ultimate execution of Louis XVI, which you have to remember was generally unprecedented in Europe at the time. Kings and queens were not executed by the people because, again, think about the Hobbesian theory that the government ultimately gets its power from God, therefore the people cannot take it away. This was an important transition towards the more Lockean modern conception of government that the people themselves ultimately are the arbiters of power and they can give it and take it at will. George Danton was a big advocate of that. But again, he's also a tragic figure in the sense that he was eventually killed by the same government that he came to represent because they considered him to not be radical enough. And it is one of those cool supposed last words. According to most sources, before he was executed, he said to his executioner while he was about to be put on the guillotine, make sure to show the people my head. It's well worth seeing. But whatever the case was, he was somebody who represented the transition towards the reign of terror, which was largely overseen by this guy, Maximilien Robespierre. So Robespierre started as a relatively politically moderate, for modern terms, lawyer. He was against the death penalty. He was a big advocate against slavery, which was, of course, still used in and around almost every major European country and the Americas. But once he became powerful, he's a great lesson in history in terms of how quickly people change once they become influential. Once he became the controller of the Committee on Public Safety, which we'll be studying in class over the next couple of days, looking at some primary sources, their main job was to protect the revolution. So what actually happened, since that was a blanket term, they were able to single out and go after basically anybody who could be considered a counter-revolutionary. Now that term came to be a catch-all. It included people who actively advocated against the revolutionary government, but it also became a term that could be used against people who just spoke openly against it. In some extreme examples, one young boy was executed because he actually chopped down a symbolic tree called a Liberty tree. He most likely chopped it down for fuel for his starving family, but was executed because the symbols became such a powerful force during the revolution, which again, I know it sounds like I'm beating a dead horse. You see this happen all the time in political revolutions, where the people who are supposed to be ultimately the ones saved by the revolution, by the end of it, end up being some of the ultimate victims. So during the Reign of Terror, it's estimated that probably about 40,000 people were sent to the guillotine. It wasn't uncommon to have people tried in the morning for crimes of counter-revolutionary activities and then killed that afternoon by the guillotine. And the events were often very public, people coming to watch them as spectators, which speaks to the bloodthirst that came from the revolution. But it's important to note that, again, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Eventually, Robespierre himself essentially ticked off enough people within the Legislative Assembly and the Committee on Public Safety that they turned on him and found him guilty of counter-revolutionary activities. They sentenced him to death, and in a cowardly fashion, he tried to commit suicide the night before, shooting himself with a pistol. He missed, essentially, and I believe just severed his jaw in two places. And when he was given a chance to really advocate for himself, he couldn't even speak. So, somewhat tragically, somewhat ironically, like George Danton, Robespierre was killed by the guillotine as well. So a couple of things worth mentioning. During the Revolutionary period, they threw out all old calendar systems. And I think they came up with, if I remember correctly, a 10-month calendar system. There was 10 days in the week. And if you notice here on this revolutionary calendar, there's that Phrygian cap that we discussed last week. This symbol shows up time and again. The Catholic Church was a huge target. Catholicism and any other Christian, and I'm sure any type of traditional religions, were outlawed and replaced with the Church of Reason. 1789, which, if you remember, is the system that we still use for years, and that's recorded basically off the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. They outlawed that system, and 1789 became year one. Again, you see that a lot in revolutionary places like North Korea, for example. I believe it's it must be year 66 there, I believe, because they date the founding and the beginning of their calendar system to the early 1950s, when Kim Il-sung became their great leader. So ultimately, we as a class need to analyze and debate. Although the French Revolution clearly failed in bringing about its primary goal of global equality, fraternity, and individual liberty, it did represent an important social change in a lot of ways, and the way that the people related to their government was hugely influenced. And in fact, any good student of modern revolutions needs to, as best they can, understand the complexities of the French Revolution, because although it's kind of cliche to be said that history repeats itself, I think a better quote that's often credited to Mark Twain is, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And what he said by that, what he was saying by that, is that essentially students of history should understand the course and tendencies of human beings, because regardless of society, regardless of time, regardless of continent, we tend to follow some of the same natural, universal laws and cravings and behaviors. And if you pay close enough attention, you can see those trends popping up time and again. So the revolutions that we study throughout this year, we're going to study revolutions in Haiti, Greece, Russia, China, all sorts of places in and around the globe. It's important to think back to the roots of our studies in the French Revolution and just how foundational that was in some of the trends and techniques that were used in those other revolutions. All right, and in class, we'll talk about the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and we'll try to pull this all together. So jot down in your margins, guys, if you have any notes or anything like that, things that you need better explanation on in class. That way, when you show up to class, you've got them physically in front of you, because it's very easy to forget. All right, thanks for following along with the video, and I'll see you guys in class.